Mumbai University, Department of Physics. He will take the session on classical mechanics, which was not covered in yesterday. So he will take it today. Siddharth.
Thank you, sir. So, hello to all the participants. And since we already introduced each other yesterday, I'll directly go to the topic. Is my screen visible?
Coming. Yes.
Okay, then I'll go ahead. Yeah. Already yesterday we were on this slide when we suddenly lost connectivity. So this is basically a partial list of topics. Most of the questions in the competitive exams are from one of these categories. Uh, there we have Lagrangian based questions, uh, Hamiltonian based questions. Okay, I'm trying to get the annotations here. Okay. I'm not sure how it works. All right. Uh, Hamiltonian based questions, collisions based questions, and scattering. These are mostly energy momentum conservation types. Then questions involving dissipative forces, central force motion, and including gravity, orbits, etc. Small oscillations. And a few dimensional or scaling arguments are sometimes very useful. So these are some kind of tricks which we can use to arrive at the answer. We will be discussing all of these in turn. So let us quickly come to a Lagrangian type problem. I just read the question briefly. There are two particles of masses m1 and m2, and their charges are q1 and q2 respectively. And they are constrained to move in a straight line along the x-axis. The Lagrangian of the system in electrostatic units is given by dash. This is a question. So how do we go about solving this question? First thing is, when you see the word electrostatic unit, you need not be afraid or anything. It just means that they have not written 1 upon 4 pi epsilon 0 in the Coulomb potential. That's the meaning. Similarly, for magnetic questions, mu 0 by 4 pi won't be there. It will be usually replaced by a C somewhere in the formula. How do you go about solving this question? Any question which involves the Lagrangian, the first question you ask is, what is the type of potential? And is it an attractive potential or a repulsive potential? The reason is, if you need to use the T minus V prescription for arriving at the Lagrangian, then you need to know the potential, and you need to know whether it inherently carries a minus sign or not, so that you can substitute correctly and arrive at the answer. So in this case, whenever you have two similar charges, two positive charges, for example, then you know that they will repel each other. So without a loss of generality, assuming that both Q1 and Q2 are positive, you can easily see that it's a repulsive potential. Hence, the potential energy term will be a positive term. Always remember, attractive potential is the negative potential, repulsive potential is positive. So we know that the Coulomb potential, and for like charges, that is if Q1 and Q2 are of the same polarity, it will be a repulsive potential. With this knowledge, you can easily write that V will be plus Q1 Q2 by x1 minus x2. And once you know this, there is a plus sign explicitly. You can use the prescription T minus V. Most of the problems where the Lagrangian is asked, T minus V works as a prescription. It won't work, for example, if you have a relativistic system. So there you have to be a little more careful. But there are very stereotype few potentials which follow that. I do not expect that it will be asked in a net exam. If it is asked, it is a by heart question as such. So using T minus V prescription, you arrive at the answer, which is B. Of course, many of you must have already spotted the answer to this question right at the beginning. But the point behind doing it in this amount of detail is to illustrate what is the thinking process, what are the logical steps which your brain should take. If any of these logical steps is missing in the logic, it may lead to a wrong answer. This is the idea. Of course, looking at the question and arriving at this answer is not at all difficult. Kinetic energy term is positive only in A and B options. Those of you who are very perceptive will notice that D option is an equally valid Lagrangian, which leads to the correct equation of motion. However, by convention, the kinetic energy term is positive, and hence the option B is the expected correct answer. Lagrangian problems can be of different types. For example, a system is given and you are asked to write down the Lagrangian by inspection or to identify number of degrees of freedom. Mainly this is done by inspection. If by looking at the description of the system it doesn't strike you, then please skip that question and move ahead. Most of the times this kind of question can only be solved by inspection. Means there is no, means if you know, you know. If you don't know, please go forward. That is the idea with this kind of questions. Sometimes a non-standard Lagrangian will be given and you will be asked to identify some extra terms which are there. That is a standard Lagrangian plus some additional term is added as a perturbation or otherwise. Then one of the simpler ways to go about it is direct substitution and quickly finding out the answer. For this, to do this within the time limit which is imposed due to competitive exams, you should have a lot of practice of solving Lagrangian type questions, because there are a lot of traps here. While taking a derivative, if you miss a minus sign, you will lead to the wrong answer. While taking a derivative, if you don't take care of constants properly, for example, the derivative of x cube is 3x. Instead of 3, if you write something else, it will lead you to the wrong answer. So you have to be extremely careful while taking these derivatives. So direct substitution is an option to identify extra terms, but you need a lot of practice to be able to do it within the prescribed time limit. If you are asked for physical interpretation of some non-standard term, usually it is something which you should have read about. It is not something you can figure out on the spot when you are seeing something new. Again, the idea is that you should have looked at a lot of Lagrangian type problems of different types, so that you know this type of term leads to this type of behavior, or vice versa. This type of system had this kind of Lagrangian, therefore this term must mean this. This comes from continuously practicing these problems, and also looking at the solved problems in different textbooks to get a better idea about what kind of terms turn up in what kind of systems Lagrangian. Another type is, given the Lagrangian, find the Hamiltonian. In this case, H is equal to T minus V doesn't work. In most of the cases, it will not work, because no one will give you a question where directly you can do T plus V. The correct prescription for finding the Hamiltonian is the definition summation pi qi dot minus L. And if you follow this prescription, it will lead you to the correct Hamiltonian. This is the definition. So one has to be careful about this. Never to, colloquially we often say H is T plus V, or it is the total energy, therefore it is potential plus kinetic energy. But this prescription often doesn't work. The correct definition is H is equal to pi qi dot summation minus L. There is a summation convention in this pi qi dot, which everyone should note. There is a summation involved. So if there are two coordinates and two momenta, the both have to be summed in this particular term. Another type of problem is where an effective potential is given and you are asked to find out the behavior. Even though this is a potential energy problem, normally these problems don't need the Lagrangian framework. And we will be looking at one such problem in the course of this particular session. Moving forward to the next class of problems, Hamiltonian type. Mostly Hamiltonian type questions come in one or two varieties. This is an example. The Hamiltonian of a system with 2 degrees of freedom is given by H is equal to Q1 P1 minus Q2 P2 plus A times Q1 square, where A is some constant, positive constant. Yes, A is a positive constant, and the function Q1, Q2 plus lambda times P1, P2, you are asked the question, is it a constant of motion? Or you are told to find the condition on lambda such that this is a constant of motion. So first question which arises here, what is constant of motion? What is the meaning of this term? And how to go about finding it in the Hamiltonian framework? Of course, all of you must be aware, a constant of motion is some quantity which doesn't vary with time. It's a function of the dynamical variables which doesn't vary with time. And the prescription in the Hamiltonian framework is to take the Poisson bracket with the Hamiltonian and put it equal, means if it turns out to be equal to 0, then F is a constant of motion. Now, this problem turns into a problem of evaluating the Poisson bracket. So you can either go by definition. The definition of the Poisson bracket is derivative of F with respect to coordinate multiplied by derivative of H with respect to momentum minus the cross term, derivative of F with respect to momentum multiplied by derivative of H with respect to coordinate. And if you do that and solve, you will end up with this particular result. That is, if you solve term by term, you end up with the final result, which is minus 2 lambda a q1 p2, something of this kind. Of course, the alternative route is to use the fundamental Poisson bracket relations, that is qi pi will be 1 and any other combinations of the q's and p's, the Poisson bracket is 0. So you can open out the Poisson brackets using the normal multiplication rules for Poisson brackets, and you will arrive, of course, at the same answer because it's the same quantity you are computing. Whichever method works for you, you can use. It's a matter of preference. However, both methods need lot of practice if you want to do it correctly, again within the given time frame. So you have to have lot of practice of this kind of problem. My personal preference is to use the definition rather than trying to use the fundamental Poisson bracket relation, but different things work for different people. You are used to some particular method, you can go ahead and use it. The answer in this case turns out that you require lambda to be 0 because you want the Poisson bracket of f comma h to be 0, and you are getting it is equal to 2 lambda a q1 p2. q1 and p2 are dynamical variables, they will take any value. A is a positive constant already given to you, so the only option to make this term 0 is that lambda should be 0. Once again, all this thinking is compressed into almost a few seconds. The rest of the time is required to actually do the algebra. So you need a lot of practice of these kind of problems. That is the real preparation. The hard work, smart work, which we have been telling you, that goes in not 5 days before the exam or 10 days before the exam. It goes in 6 months before the exam. So if you continuously keep practicing different problems of different types, that is the only way you will get proficiency enough to be able to do it within time frame. If the net paper were 6 hours long, double the number of people would pass it. One of the major constraints is the time constraint within which you have to do the problem. And you need practice for that. There is no shortcut for that as such. I mean, even with the shortcut, you need practice. Coming to the types of questions which you can expect under Hamiltonian, we have questions like the one we saw, constants of motion, finding whether a particular function is a constant of motion or not, finding the condition under which it will be a constant of motion, given two known quantities which are constants of motion, trying to generate new constants of motion. All of these are merely implementations of the Poisson bracket formalism. So that is the easiest way to do it. So having lot of practice with Poisson bracket type of evaluations is a very good practice for this class of problems. Canonical transformations, whether a particular transformation is given and is it canonical or not, or there will be some parameter like the previous question, what should be the value of this parameter such that this particular transformation is canonical. The simplest rule to do this is to take the Poisson bracket of the new coordinates and new momenta. If they satisfy the fundamental Poisson bracket relations, then the transformation is canonical. Otherwise, it is not. So I am just emphasizing again and again, it's all implementation of the Poisson bracket evaluation. which you have to do. That is, so you practice the Poisson bracket for 15, 20 functions, you are ready for this entire class of problems. That is the idea. And in addition, sometimes a time dependent Hamiltonian is given and you are asked to either find the equations of motion, or you are asked questions like, is the energy conserved, is the total energy conserved, or what is the difference between the total energy and the Hamiltonian. These kind of questions are asked. And in this case, most of the time by inspection plus prior knowledge, if you have had practice of this kind of, you have come across such systems in the before, that really prepares you for this kind of question. Of course, for some of them, you can go into explicitly finding out the equations of motion. It will not be difficult. However, you need practice of this beforehand. Only then you can attempt such questions in the exam. If you have not practiced that class of problems, usually better than wasting, even if you know the technique, if you have not practiced, you will not do it within time. That's a very important thing to realize. Just knowledge of the technique doesn't guarantee that you will be able to solve the problem within the time constraint. So such questions are ones where you can mark it, like Madkaikar sir told you in the techniques for attempting the question paper, you can mark them with a circle and move forward. In the sense, later on you will come back to that problem, suppose after solving all the questions, which you can do quickly. That's a good idea for such types of questions where you need to do some amount of algebra to arrive at the solution. Another class of problems which you come across is collisions, scattering, this kind of problems. And in all of these, the sacrosanct or the most sacred laws of physics, conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, in some cases even conservation of angular momentum. These are the only things which you need to know as such to solve the problem in principle. In practice, again, repeat of what I have been saying, you need lots of practice problems if you want to do this within time limit. The question here is as follows. As shown in the figure, a ball of mass m is suspended by an inextensible massless string. It is released from a height h and collides elastically when it is at its lowest point with a block of mass 2m, which is at rest on a frictionless surface. Now, if you look at this diagram, it looks like the ball is going to crash into the ground before it ever hits the other mass. But this is a real diagram taken from a real net paper. Actually, this is, I think, Maharashtra set. But such diagrams, which may not be physically accurate, could be there in the paper. The idea is to read the question and not take the diagram literally, but understand the idea. So here, even though the ball looks like it is going to crash into the ground, you are told that the ball is actually going to go and hit the mass of mass 2m. And so you have to take that sense and do the problem without getting confused by the diagram. How to go about solving such a problem? When the collision takes place, you need to know how much was the energy, because you need to know how much was the momentum. How to go about it is very straightforward. You know law of conservation of energy. If it had initial energy of mgh, then at the lowest point, all of that mgh is converted to half mv square, which is numerically equal to that mgh. So the energy is equal to whatever was the original height multiplied by gravity, acceleration due to gravity multiplied by mass. That is the energy. And from that, you can easily get the momentum using square root of 2me. And you will find that you know the momentum as well. That is good. Now what do you do? Of course, the long cut here is to actually sit and do momentum calculations. However, it is extremely useful to learn by heart at least a few formulae. One class of problems is mass number 2 is stationary and mass number 1 comes with a certain momentum or a certain velocity. The second class is when both are moving towards each other with equal and opposite momenta. These two classes of formulae, if you know by heart, you don't have to by heart everything under the sun, but if you know these two classes of formulae, then it simplifies a lot of problems substantially, which you would otherwise take a long time to attempt. So here, if you know elastic scattering formulas for a stationary target, the velocity, v1 being the velocity of the first particle and v2 being the velocity of the stationary particle, then after collision, the V1 prime is given by this formula and V2 prime is given by this formula. These are useful formulae to know by heart. Of course, if you don't, then this is a circle question. You circle it, go ahead, solve everything, and then come back and if time permits, do the momentum balance in detail. But it will take time. It's just a simultaneous equation thing, but it will eat up time. When you use this formula, you can easily obtain that if you, since you know that m1 is m and m2 is 2m, you can substitute and you can get that the final velocity is 1/3 of the initial velocity. Therefore, the final kinetic energy will be 1/9 of the initial kinetic energy, and therefore the final height which it rises after collision will be 1/9 of the initial height. So the correct answer is option A, which is h/9. And for doing these problems within time, I again emphasize, you have to have practiced at least a dozen problems of this kind. Only then the approach will be clear to you and you will quickly go through the steps. Otherwise, you will get stuck at one of these points in this whole solution procedure. So practice is essential. The solution, as we said, is h/9. Another type of problem which you come across, dissipation. When a dissipative force is present, how do you go about it? This particular problem has a straightforward answer which some of you can try to guess. Maybe all of you will guess it. But let us go through the motion of how to solve this problem properly. The first question, okay, let me read the question first. A particle of mass m is released from a large height. As it falls down, it experiences a resistive force which is proportional to its own velocity. So the velocity v bar is given by actually literally v with a line on top instead of an arrow. This kind of things happen in print in actual question paper. So one has to be used to these kind of things. Velocity v bar with k as a constant of proportionality. So the resistive force is k times v bar. You are asked to find the asymptotic value of the velocity of the particle. Asymptotic means as time t tends to a large number, or eventually it will attain a velocity. Of course, all of you must be familiar with this particular concept of a limiting velocity when the ball is falling through a viscous medium. But again, let us go through the motions of what is the system to solve such problems. The idea is to have your mind trained in a particular way to think the logical steps. And this kind of training comes only when you repeatedly solve the problems. So that all these steps which are manual, the first time you solve the problem, by the time you write the exam, those steps will become automated in your mind. You have to train yourself that way. So here, the first question you can ask is, what is the equation of motion, which is easily written down by inspection. It is mx double dot is minus mg, the gravitational force, plus kx dot, where x is the coordinate measured in the upward direction. So the forces are in this manner, and you can simplify this because there is no x term anywhere. You can write x dot as v and x double dot as v dot. So you get a single first order differential equation directly for the velocity. So now the question is how to solve. It's a first order differential equation with an inhomogeneous term minus mg. So you can of course use the machinery of solving first order differential equations, take the integral and then use the complementary function, etc. However, first note, you are only asked for the asymptotic value. Asymptotic means that it will attain some kind of constant value towards the end. That is the meaning, which means that v dot will be equal to 0. If you put v dot equal to 0, you can directly get an expression for v, and that turns out to be v is equal to mg by k, which is option number C. So just by inspection, you can do all this. You need not actually try to solve anything. However, if you want to do a complete solution, it is fine. That can be done also if you have practiced enough number of differential equation problems in mathematical physics, because you know the classes of problems which you have, and most physical systems, it is good to solve. For example, a constant force, a force which is linear, all these things you can solve beforehand and keep it in the back or stored in your memory bank, so that at least by inspection you can arrive at the answer in a fairly forward manner. Of course, you don't have time for explicitly solving first order differential equation is okay. If you have a second order differential equation, there is no time. Even if you know the exact procedure, there is no time to sit and solve. Please remember that. So it is good to familiarize ourselves with what are the standard types of differential equations which come up in mechanics, and have the solution stored at the back of your mind, at least the form of the solution. And this is the, okay, I don't know what is that. So you get this solution. All right. Of course, for those of you who are clever, you will realize that only one solution is dimensionally correct. The others have wrong dimensions. But dimension analysis may not always work, because if this is suppose in the B part of the net paper, they can easily move the same question to the C part and make all the questions have the same all the solutions have the same dimensions. And in that case, you will not be able to distinguish between the solutions. I am sorry, Vivek sir, is there some disturbance on the line from my side?
No, it's perfectly fine.
Okay, okay. Because there is someone started playing loud music outside my window. So the next class of problems which we'll go towards is the central force problem. Now, central force is a very wide topic, but I have taken a small selection of problems from that, and we'll be looking at that. But there can be a wider variety also. This particular problem, let me read out. In the attractive Kepler problem described by the central potential V is equal to minus K by R, for example, the gravitational potential, where K is a positive constant, a particle of mass m with non-zero angular momentum can never reach the center due to the centrifugal barrier. This you know, that if you try to move towards the center, the centripetal force acts and pushes you away. If we modify the potential to dash dash dash, some form is given. The second term which is added could differ from different problems, but what we will do is we'll try to do it in as general a manner as possible. In this case, the second term is a cubic term in 1 by r. It is beta divided by r cube. It is also negative, which means that it adds to the attractive nature of the potential. The question which is asked is, one finds that in this case, there is a critical value of the angular momentum called L critical, below which there is no centrifugal barrier. So the centrifugal barrier is there up to a certain point, and then the potential becomes attractive. So you are asked to find what is the value of the critical angular momentum, and you are given 4 options. Once again, this problem is easily solved by looking at dimensions, because all 4 of the solutions have different dimensions. You just have to figure out which one has the dimensions of angular momentum. However, as I said, if someone wants to make this problem tricky, then they'll just give 4 solutions, like the same solution, only the number they'll change, 12, 6, 3, 4. And the power outside the bracket will be the same for all 4. Then you will anyway be stuck. So it is a good idea to have a clear idea how to solve the problem completely. First question, what is centrifugal barrier? And this is something anyone who has studied central force motion should remember. It is the term plus L square by 2m r square, which is part of the effective potential experienced by the particle. Actually, it is a kinetic energy term. But if you want to solve the radial problem separately and the angular problem separately, in the separation of variables, as far as the angular motion is concerned, L square by 2m r square acts as an additional potential energy term, because it is a function of r. And so the effective potential in a central force problem is whatever is the actual potential plus L square by 2m r square. This is something extremely important to know. Once you know this, you can actually quickly sketch how the central potential is going to look. You know that how the 1 by r potential looks, minus 1 by r. You also know how the centrifugal barrier potential looks. And if you have a cubic term with a minus sign, it will be even steeper than the 1 by r square. That is something which is quite straightforward. So the blue curve is the centrifugal barrier. It's a positive part. And the red and black curves, the red is the original central Kepler potential. And the black is the additional term, minus beta by r cube. And if you only had the Kepler potential and the centrifugal barrier term, the blue solid curve is what you get, this kind of shape. And if you add the third term, then you get something which is asymptotically the same, but at low r, it has a different behavior. In particular, it has a bump at one point beyond which there is no centrifugal barrier. And you are asked to find the property of that particular bump. So whenever there is a bump, the first thing you do is try to find the derivative and find the, because identify whether that particular point can be a maximum or not. In the diagram, it is a maximum, but mathematically, what is the condition for that is what we want to find. So first step is take the derivative of this effective potential and put it equal to 0. When you take the derivative, you get this particular expression. A power of r increases everywhere in the denominator. All signs get changed and some constants get introduced in the numerator. The 2 which is introduced in the second term gets cancelled with the 2 which was already there in the denominator. And in the third term, a 3 gets introduced. With this, you need to put this particular term equal to 0. You will realize that this equation is nothing but a quadratic equation in 1 by r, because r square can cancel straight away in all the denominators. And so it's a quadratic equation in 1 by r, which is easily solved using our normal quadratic equation formula. And in that particular thing also, you can see that there is a square root term involving the angular momentum. And if that has to be real, then the L power 4 has to be positive. And second thing is, if there has to be a unique value of r, then your discriminant term, that is the square root term, has to be 0. If you put the square root term equal to 0, you end up with the condition that the angular momentum at that particular point has to be 12 times k m square beta to the power 1 by 4. If you look at the 4 options, this is nothing but option C. As we already discussed, this particular problem in its current state can easily be solved by dimensional analysis, but someone may always play a trick on you and ensure that there are 2 or 3 options with the same dimensional build-up, and so you cannot use dimensional analysis for such problems. Then you need to know this particular procedure. This is a simple problem in which an effective potential is used and the solution is found. In all central force problems, wherever the effective potential is involved, one should not forget the L square by 2m r square centrifugal barrier term, even if it is not explicitly mentioned in the question. Here, it was fortunate that it is mentioned in the question, but if it is not, it is very important to realize that that term is also there. So, central force problems, let us try to look at the types which arise. Sometimes the potential will be given and you are asked to find the nature of the trajectory. Normally, if you are used to, or if you have glanced through several such problems before, then mostly you can do this by inspection. Again, it is a part of your training. And if not by inspection, then at least a quick calculation, a back of the envelope calculation as they call it, can be done, and you can arrive at that particular solution to find the nature of the trajectory. Because in the effective potential, if it is bounded on both sides, then the trajectory is closed. If it is not bounded on one side, the trajectory is an open trajectory. So it cannot be elliptical or circular or something. It has to be a open curve. So whether it is bounded or unbounded, these kind of questions can be answered simply by looking at the potential energy curve and the actual energy of the particle. The stability of the trajectory is another question, which again you have to check the conditions on the effective potential curve. So in all these situations, being able to sketch this particular function becomes extremely important. You don't need a very accurate sketch. A rough sketch will do, but you should have the ability to make those sketches, as it was outlined in the lecture for mathematical physics, that this is an inherent ability which we have to develop. Here the conditions are not difficult. It will always be a function of r, and you can try to draw it accordingly. Another class of problems, which is a subclass of central force problems, is questions about satellites and their orbits, etc. Again, the nature of the orbit is same as nature of trajectory, what we discussed earlier. You can do it by inspection, or you can check the conditions on the effective potential curve, and most of the time this can be worked out. Then there is a set of formulae which it is better to know by heart: escape velocity, critical velocity for launching a particular satellite into orbit. One very important trick in problems involving what is the height of the satellite type of problem. There are questions which are framed this way: what is the height of the satellite above the Earth's surface? There, when you do the actual calculation, you will get the answer for the distance from center of the Earth till the satellite. From that, you have to subtract radius of the Earth. This is a common trick which people miss and end up with the wrong answer. So whenever in central force motion you are doing this, the r which you get, the distance, is distance from center of the Earth. The question often asks what is the distance from the surface of the Earth. So you have to minus the radius. This is something important to note. Escape velocity calculation, it can be done by explicit computation, provided you know the formula beforehand. Change of orbit, again, normally for change of orbit, the potential energy curve approach is simpler, because if you are changing from here to here, what is going to happen? But it is also useful to have the formula for change of orbit available with you. So it is important to review key formulae before the exam as far as central force motion problems are concerned, because here there are quite a few formulae. Another place where it is important to review is the collisions part: elastic collision, scattering, and so on. It is useful to know the formula by heart. I'll come to the next class of problems. I'll try to spend some time on this and the next section, because I feel those are very important. Here is a question from the part C from the NET exam from some year, I don't remember. Let me read the question. Two particles of mass m1 and m2 are connected by a massless thread of length L, as shown in the figure below. The particle of mass m1, I believe there is a typing mistake. There should be a particle of mass m1 on the plane, undergoes a circular motion with radius r0 and angular momentum capital L. When a small radial displacement epsilon, where epsilon is much less than r0, is applied, its radial coordinate is found to oscillate about r0. So to visualize what is happening, I hope you can see my video in the corner of your screen. So to visualize what is happening, this particle is moving around in circles, and you give a slight tug to this one, then basically in the plane this particle is doing this kind of motion, going radially inward and outward, at the same time moving along the circle, and the mass which is suspended will go up and down because the string is inextensible. It will do that. So basically you have got something like this. This is moving like this, and this is moving round and round with little bit of oscillation, something of this kind. So in such a situation, you are asked to find what will be the frequency of oscillations. And you are given 4 options. This is what I was talking about. Dimension analysis doesn't help. All of them have the same dimensions. Still, one can try to guess the answer. I am not suggesting that you do it, because you may end up guessing wrong. Guessing is the last option you should have. Especially with negative marking, you should avoid guessing completely. But if you are asked to guess the correct answer, how will you go about it? To understand that, see, in this problem, you have 4 options. 2 of them contain the number 7 and the other 2 contain the number 3. Now, in usual mechanical problems, the only way where integers arise usually is by taking derivative. You take derivative of a cubic term, you will get 3 times the square. If you take derivative of a square term, you will get 2 times that particular quantity, etc. To get the number 7, you should have something to the power 7 initially in the potential, so that when you differentiate it, it becomes 7 into x to the power 6, whatever it is. So it is highly unlikely that the number 7 will turn up just like that in a mechanical problem. The numbers which you expect to turn up are 2, 3, 4. Usually, again I am repeating, for example, in moment of inertia type of problem, 7, 5, these are common. But in this kind of mechanical problem with central force motion, etc., it is unlikely to encounter 7. So A and B are much less likely options than C and D. This is the first point. Second point, what is oscillating? The mass M1 and M2 are oscillating with the inextensible string connecting them, basically. So the total mass of the oscillating object is roughly M1 plus M2, something of this kind. M1 plus M2 is moving in, out, in, out. The whole mass M1 plus M2 is doing that. Now, you know the usual formula for oscillation frequency is square root of K by M, where K is something called the spring constant and M is the mass. So if M1 plus M2 is oscillating, then you expect M1 plus M2 to be in the denominator. In option D, M1 plus M2 is there in the denominator. In option C, it is not there. So already we have A is the least likely option, B and C are less likely option, and D is the most likely option. This is just where logic takes us. I am not saying that in the NET exam you sit and do this logic. Rather, I would prefer you go and solve the problem. But if you are getting after computation, if you get one of these answers, then recheck. Because physically it is not intuitive at all to get those answers. Anyway, let us actually proceed to how to go about solving this problem. It is a problem in small oscillations. So we will use the ideas of small oscillations. So the first point is how to start. And the answer is that you start with the effective potential energy. Why you start with the effective potential energy? Because since you are talking about small oscillations, okay, let us first write down the effective potential. The effective potential energy is nothing but you take all the quantities which depend on velocities and call it effective kinetic energy. Take everything else and put it rather everything which depends on the coordinates and call it effective potential energy. In this case, what you are trying to achieve is, suppose there is some potential which is acting on M1 plus M2. You want to find out an approximate potential which mimics the behavior near the equilibrium position. The equilibrium position will be the bottom of the well. So near that, you can see the dotted line approximates the red line. So the idea here is that we want to find out the effective potential in this region and then approximate it as a parabola, that is a quadratic kind of term. So in this case, the effective potential energy is basically the centrifugal barrier term plus the gravitational potential energy acting on the mass M2. So the centrifugal barrier prevents M1 from coming closer. Gravity is pulling M2 downwards. And these two are balanced when M1 is revolving in this plane, so that M2 remains stationary. You perturb it slightly, they both move. It is like a merry-go-round kind of thing. This one moves in and out and the other one moves up and down. And basically, if you tell R is the current coordinate and R0 is the original coordinate which you had, then you can rewrite this V effective in terms of epsilon. And when you do that, what you end up getting is the following. So you can expand the term which has epsilon in the denominator. Epsilon numerator is already in terms of epsilon. You need not disturb it. You can expand this term and you will find that you get a term which doesn't contain epsilon, a linear term and a quadratic term. And this one expands into a term which doesn't contain epsilon and a linear term. Now, we are, the shortcut here is only consider the quadratic term, and the rest of them in a effective potential problem automatically cancel. You can sit and prove that, that is not an issue, but to save time, you can assume that all those terms cancel each other happily, and all you are left with is the, either they cancel each other or they turn out to be constant, in which case you can say I am shifting the zero of the potential by some amount. and you end up with only the quadratic term. So basically expand whatever effective potential to have in a Taylor series and only retain the quadratic term. Once you have only the quadratic term, it is basically reduced to a simple harmonic oscillator kind of potential, kx square kind of potential. You can identify what is k by looking at this. You will find that k is whatever is in the bracket, 3l square upon m1 r0 to the power 4. Whatever you get by default, that is the thing. And if you try to find out the oscillation frequency as square root of k by m, where m is m1 plus m2 kind of thing, then you end up with this particular expression. I think there is a substitution here for L square by m1 r0 to the power 4. From the equilibrium condition, it should be substituted as m2g times r0. And therefore, you end up getting this particular expression. So if you look at this particular solution, this is the one which we had guessed based on some kind of logical arguments that it should be the correct answer. It turns out that that one is the correct answer. Of course, I am not saying guess right at the beginning, but see, suppose you are close to the time getting over in the NET exam, you are coming across such a question, you don't have time to solve. You can always make an educated guess on a few questions where if you trust your intuition, provided you have built up that intuition by solving a large number of problems. But blind guesswork is something to be avoided completely. So the answer D, which we had guessed to be the correct answer, actually turns out to be the correct answer. The small oscillation problem, the key idea is the one which is given in red. Expand the potential as a Taylor series and retain only the quadratic term. It will lead you to the solution. My final part of this particular discussion on classical mechanics is to introduce the idea of scaling. We have already seen the idea of dimensional arguments in a couple of problems before, even though we solved it by the long route, but you can solve or you can arrive at the answer to those just by looking at the dimensions. By the way, dimensional arguments work across the board, not just classical mechanics, quantum mechanics, electrodynamics, nuclear physics, atomic physics, everywhere. There could always be a problem which is simply solvable by looking at the dimensions of the four options and eliminating the wrong ones. In fact, what was discussed in the mathematical physics lecture by Dr. Kolvankar of the x square, d square, y by dx square kind of problems, it is a similar idea. You have to have the same scaling of x across all the terms. It's a similar idea. Let us look at this particular problem. Assume that the earth revolves in a circular orbit around the sun. I believe it's obscured in my screen, but around the sun, I suppose. Yes, around the sun. Suppose the gravitational constant g varies slowly as a function of time. In particular, it decreases to half its initial value in the course of 1 million years. Then during this time, dash, what will happen? One of these four things will happen. This is a net problem, so it is not going to have multiple correct answers. Only one of these four things is right. So the options are, I'll read it for completeness. Radius of the Earth's orbit will increase by a factor of 2 is one option. Second option, total energy of the Earth remains constant is the second option. Third is orbital angular momentum of the Earth will increase. And the fourth is radius of the Earth's orbit remains the same. So A and D are kind of opposite of each other. B and C are some additional things. How do you go about tackling this problem? The approach which I am going to present here is the approach of scaling. It's basically an extension of the idea of dimensional analysis to take it to one more additional level. But first, let us eliminate a few of the things which are not going to happen. First thing, you know that the potential energy term in this case is gmm by r, where g is the gravitational constant, capital M is mass of the sun, small m is mass of the earth, and r is the sun-earth distance. So if g is going to gradually go down in value, then the potential energy also correspondingly reduces because it contains g, and you have capital M, small m, and you still don't know what is going to happen to r. But if g decreases, what happens? If G decreases, then the earth is less attracted to the sun. So you would assume that probably it will start drifting away, or it will remain at the same point. We don't know yet. Certainly it is not going to come closer. This is something which you can imagine. So the total energy of the earth remaining constant doesn't seem like a proper option. The other thing, earth is moving in a circular orbit and G is varying very, very slowly, that is adiabatically, very slowly. Then one would assume that the earth continues in a circular orbit, only the radius of that circular orbit will change very, very gradually. It is not going to suddenly change overnight. So it will remain in a circular orbit of changing size or of the same size. We don't know yet. Okay? But it is still having a potential energy term which is only R dependent. It's a central force. And in any central force problem, one of the sacred rules is angular momentum will not change. Whatever else dunya idhar ka udhar hone do, angular momentum is not going to change. So option C, strike it out first. The moment you see it's a central force problem, angular momentum is not going to change. This is something like you have to drill this into your head. Angular momentum is not going to change in a central force problem. Okay? So once you have done that, then only the option to eliminate remains between A and D, more or less. Maybe few percent possibility that it is answer B. But let us go and look at this. Let us start with the kinetic and potential energy term. What is the potential energy term? It is G into mass of sun, mass of earth divided by radius of the orbit. Kinetic energy term, since there is no half m r square theta dot square term, because there is no radial oscillation, it's a circular orbit. Therefore, all the kinetic energy is only rotational kinetic energy. It will be given by L square by 2me, mass 2 times mass of earth into r orbital square. Actually, in place of mass of earth, it should be reduced mass. But since mass sun is much heavier than earth, you can safely take in the kinetic energy denominator, you can take mass of earth. Now, if you look at these two things, what are the constants? Angular momentum is constant. Ms and me are constants. So the only thing which are varying is G is going to change, which is told to you, and R is going to change. Everything else is a constant. Angular momentum in particular, that is why I emphasize that point. Angular momentum is a constant. So since the orbit remains circular, you know that for a circular orbit, T is exactly equal to half of V, and therefore means with the minus sign, means T is equal to minus half of V basically for a circular orbit, and therefore the ratio of T by V will remain constant. It will always be minus 1 by 2. If you take the ratio of T and V in this particular case, you will end up with this relation. G times R orbital is a constant. So if G is going down by a factor of 2, what will happen to R? To keep the product constant, R will increase by a factor of 2. Simple. This is a basic idea of scaling. Means T and V will scale together because the orbit remains circular. So if V is increasing, decreasing by a certain amount, T will also do it. But the dependence of T and V on various parameters is different. So those particular parameters are forced to change in a certain correlated way. That is the idea of the scaling argument. And with that, you can you can arrive at the answer. The only input you had was it's a central force problem. Angular momentum is conserved. And then you just write down kinetic energy, potential energy, you will arrive at the answer. So this is a part C question in NET exam. Doesn't take time to solve at all if you know the right approach. Scaling is not something which will suggest itself to you automatically. Problems which you have already solved, you can go back and see whether some scaling argument is there in that problem, and you can try to solve it accordingly. Again, you need to look at many problems like this and see where this argument is applicable. Actually apply it and see, and prepare your mind for that particular approach. It will be very valuable in saving some time for few of the questions. Just to elaborate on this particular thing further, okay, the key idea in scaling argument is check the ratios of quantities which must vary similarly with each other. In this case, kinetic and potential energy had to vary in the same manner. but their dependence on G and R were different. Using that, we managed to extract this information that the radius of the Earth's orbit will change. So let me give a few illustrations of scaling before I stop. This is a very general idea. Consider many systems in mechanics. You will find that the kinetic energy term is of the form half mx dot square, and the potential energy is proportional to some power of n. I'll give a few examples just now, but consider this: kinetic energy is half mx dot square, potential energy is k x to the power n. Now, suppose I decide that I want to go from, let us say, MKS units to CGS units. I decide to change the scale on which I am measuring X. Or instead of measuring distance in centimeters, I'll measure it in inches. Instead of measuring time in seconds, I'll measure it in minutes, suppose. Then what happens? My new X is alpha times the old X, where alpha is the conversion factor for the units. And my new T is beta times the new old T. That is the conversion factor for the time units. This is nothing but I have rescaled the time scale and distance scale of the problem to a new scale. If you are uncomfortable with this equation, you can write x prime is equal to alpha x and t prime is equal to beta t, and that if that works for you better, fine. If you do this, then what happens to the kinetic energy term? Kinetic energy term is proportional to x square by t square. So the new kinetic energy term scales as alpha to the power 2 and beta to the power minus 2, just because of the scaling of the distance and time variables. The potential energy term, on the other hand, scales as alpha to the power n, because it contains only x to the power n. Now, important thing, this is the same system. I just changed my units of measurement. That is the understanding here. So obviously the ratio of potential kinetic energy will not change. Numerically, their values won't change. Therefore, immediately I get a relation by taking t minus v equal to constant. I get a relation between beta and alpha. That relation turns out to be, if you solve this properly, beta is equal to alpha to the power 1 minus n by 2, where n is the number which is occurring in the power in the potential energy term. This becomes an extremely nice tool to get information about the system. Let me give you a few examples. Consider the potential energy is equal to mgz. The normal gravity, constant gravity field, height dependence. The power of z in the potential energy, n is equal to 1. This gives you the relation that time scale and distance scale will be related as t goes as z power 1 by 2. How? Because t is scaled according to beta and z is scaled according to alpha, but alpha is nothing but, beta is nothing but alpha to the power 1 minus n by 2. If you substitute n as 1, you get 1 minus 1 by 2, which is half. This is exactly what you get for a simple pendulum in a gravity field. What is the time period of the simple pendulum? T is proportional to square root of L. So this information, so suppose you are told pendulum length is doubled, what will happen to the time period? This is a simple way to go about it. If you don't remember the formula, T is proportional to square root of L by G. If you don't know, then this is a way to arrive at the same thing. Another example, take the Kepler potential, V is equal to minus K by R, N is minus 1, and this tells you that T goes as R to the power 3 by 2. This is well known. This is nothing but the physical content of Kepler's third law of motion. So if you are told a orbit problem where suppose the radius increases by this much, what will happen to the time period, blah, 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 you can immediately obtain the answer without much of work. Similarly, consider the simple harmonic oscillator. V is proportional to half k x square. Again, here n is equal to 2. And if you substitute n equal to 2, you get beta is alpha to the power 0, which means that the time scale won't be related to the distance scale at all, which we know very well. For a simple harmonic oscillator, the time period doesn't depend on the amplitude at all. So this kind of scaling argument, suppose you are asked a question in some exam that consider a particle moving under a potential a x to the power 4. If it is released from a point A, its time period is so and so. If it is released from 2A, what will be its time period? You can use the same argument, put n equal to 4, arrive at the relation and arrive at the answer. So this particular approach gives you a very, very wide-ranging tool to find out relations between, in this particular case, I have illustrated the relation between time scales and distance scales for a given problem. If the distance scales by this much amount, how to get the time scale? Everywhere, the argument used is that potential and kinetic energy to scale by the same amount, but the potential and kinetic energy depend on the other variables in a different manner, and therefore by scaling the potential and kinetic energy, you arrive at a relation between these variables and use that to your advantage. This is a summary of the scaling approach. I would like to conclude the session here, but these are a few of the reference books which you can actually use. For Lagrangian and Hamiltonian dynamics, I would recommend going through Goldstein and the problems at the back of Goldstein. That will prepare you well enough. Of course, there are a few other books in this list which are also useful. Collisions, scattering, dissipative forces, these kind of things are dealt with at an elementary level in Sears and Szymanski, the second book in the list, University Physics. And also slightly more advanced in Kleppner and Kolenko, which is the third book in the list. And for little better treatment, you can go to Simon's book. All three are useful. Three books have three different approaches. So whichever works for you, you can use. All these topics are basically covered in all the books. For central force, motion, gravity, and orbits, in particular, I would like to recommend John Taylor's book, Classical Mechanics. But central force motion is also covered in all the other books also. You can use a mix and match of these books. It's not, these are my references for these particular topics, but all these books deal more or less with all the topics. You can use any of your choice. And the scaling argument, which I displayed at the end in particular, as well as the treatment of small oscillations, even though it's not a really elementary book, I would recommend to at least read through those sections in Landau and Lifshitz, because it is done very concisely and almost magically the things come out in that book. So it's a useful book to just read through. It's not recommended for as a course of study, use only that book. I would not recommend it because it's quite difficult, frankly, to go through everything through that book. But a few arguments are very well placed in that, so you can go through that as well. With this, I thank you very much. And my email ID is given here. So anytime you can feel free to contact me personally, or you can contact me through the concepts email ID also. Eventually the organizers will pass on the queries to me. So thank you very much. I hope the lecture was useful for you. Thank you.
A number of questions. I will first say that there are two problems which people want to be explained again. One is Suresh Sadashivami says that, can you please repeat the central force problem?
Okay.
And the other is the Hamiltonian problem. Sujita wants you to explain the Hamiltonian problem also.
Okay, I'll do that. Let me share my screen back. I should not have unshared it to start with. Anyway, I completely forgot that there is a question session. Is it visible now, my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So let me go. There are a lot of animations, so this is going to go a bit slow, but okay. By central force problem, I believe they mean this one, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the statement is here. The statement of the problem is clear enough. And when we write down effective potential energy, basically in a central force problem, the kinetic energy term, which is half m x dot square plus y dot square plus z dot square in 3 dimensions, it can be rewritten as half m r dot square plus half m r square theta dot square. The r square theta dot square term, because of conservation of angular momentum, can be rewritten as L square by 2m r square. So you have a kinetic energy term, which is a pure half m r dot square. You call it the effective kinetic energy. And this particular term, L square by 2m r square, you take it into the potential energy and call that total thing, this actual potential energy plus the L square by 2m r square, call it effective potential energy. So that the one-dimensional problem in radial coordinates is basically half m r dot square as the effective kinetic energy plus the original potential added to the centrifugal barrier, that is the effective potential energy for the central problem, radial problem. And then basically what I was saying is that you need to be able to sketch this. Let me bring up all the sketches and then describe. Basically, we know that at large distances 1 by r term will dominate, and therefore at large distances asymptotically this potential will tend to 0. At some intermediate stage, the 1 by r square term, which is a positive term, will dominate, and it will try to take the potential at r tending to 0 in an upward direction, as it is happening in the blue curve. But since we have added a third term, which is minus 1 by r cube, minus means again it will take it down. R cube means as r grows smaller and smaller, this particular term grows bigger and bigger. And so at some stage, that particular term will take over from this centrifugal term, which is trying to take the potential up and again pull it in the downward direction.
So there is also a question about what is the effect of 1 over r cube term on central force. So at this point, I think you can reiterate that.
I mean in physical terms?
Yes. What is it? She says that, Kamya Pandey says that usually we have V is equal to minus K by R in central force problem. What is the effect of 1 over R cube term on central force?
First thing is to check whether it is plus 1 by R cube or minus 1 by R cube. If it is plus 1 by R cube, it makes more or less no difference. It only makes some difference at extremely high kinetic energies. But if it is minus 1 by r cube, then it makes the potential energy curve of this particular form, which means that if you manage to go to a very, very small distance, then basically you are bounded to be within that particular region and you can never approach outside unless your kinetic energy is increased beyond a certain limit. So basically the 1 by r cube term creates 3 different regimes of the possible existence of the particle. If you specify the kinetic energy of the particle to be a certain value, then it doesn't mean that it will always be in a bounded orbit between 2 different values of r. Another possible solution opens up. If it started out very, very close to the origin, then it will be bounded in a very, very small region near the origin. In fact, when I was setting this problem, I was just thinking that maybe this is a good kind of model for the nuclear potential kind of thing. I don't know if this is actually used. I am not a nuclear physicist, but the nature of the curve definitely mimics what you normally see as drawn for the nuclear potential. That is, beyond a certain limit, it takes over and becomes highly attractive. But beyond that limit, basically there is a barrier. This is how I would describe this particular potential. The black potential is what you get. The solid black line is what you get after adding the 1 by r cube term to the usual central potential, which is the 1 by r plus L square by 2m r minus K by r plus L square by 2m r square. That is the blue curve. Blue is what you usually have for the central force problem. The addition of the minus 1 by r cube term gives you the black curve, which has an attractive region below a certain limit. Now coming to this particular problem in detail, what we have done is that we want to locate the peak of this particular part, this point. And for that, we take derivative of the potential energy and we arrive at this, and we arrive at a condition on 1 by r where this is the point where it will have maxima or minima. So the plus and minus is because there is one local maximum here and one local minimum here. So there will be 2 solutions for the maximum and minimum. However, if this term becomes 0, then there is no local maximum or minimum, basically after the 1 by r, directly the 1 by r cube takes over and there is no additional barrier term left at all. That is the interpretation in this equation. And when that happens, actually this does not represent a maximum or minimum. I believe it will turn out to be an inflection point. I have not verified it, but that is what I would guess. That is, as the L value changes, this point and this point start coming close to each other, and at one point the potential after 1 by r directly goes to 1 by r cube, and there is no centrifugal barrier at all. That happens when this particular square root term goes to 0. And if you try to put the square root term to 0, then you will get an expression for L, and that will turn out to be this particular expression. This is the explanation for this particular problem which I was giving. And if there is a further discussion required, definitely you can write to me directly and I can provide a further explanation. Now coming to the other problem, the Hamiltonian problem, which was before all this. So because of the animations, I have to go slow. Okay.
There's a question about that also, that what is the significance of lambda in the Hamiltonian?
There is no lambda in the Hamiltonian. It's the function
Hamiltonian
f.
problem. In the Hamiltonian problem.
Okay, physical significance I have actually not thought of. It is proportional to the product of the two momenta, but the Hamiltonian itself is a very strange object. I don't know what system it corresponds to. This is a more of a mathematical exercise, even as far as the net paper is concerned, as far as I can understand, because to find out which system this pertains to, I don't think it is a straightforward matter. I don't have a physical feel for this particular Hamiltonian, but the problem itself is solvable as a purely algebraic exercise. The significance of lambda, I am myself not sure, but as an algebraic exercise, either you start with the definition of Poisson bracket, which is df by dq into dh by dp minus df by dp into dh by dq, where it is understood that you are summing over all qi's and pi's, and that leads you to this particular result, which is shown in the lower part. On the other hand, if you take the Poisson bracket directly and try to expand it in terms of QI using the sum and product rules for Poisson brackets, basically, then you end up with this particular approach. Ultimately, they both end up at the same point. So it's a matter of convenience whether you are more conversant with using the fundamental Poisson bracket relation at every point, or you do it by definition, that is using the derivatives of f and h with respect to the coordinates and momenta. My personal preference is for directly using the definition, because in using the fundamental Poisson bracket repeatedly, there can be more mistakes. So my personal preference is to use the definition directly, but it is a matter entirely of your choice. Physical significance of lambda, I have not thought about it, and I don't think it is a straightforward matter to arrive at that. That is how I would put it.
There's a question about the problem of two masses. You took R as coordinate for kinetic energy and potential energy. What is the origin for this system?
Okay, very nice question. I'll come to that problem. The origin is the center of this particular circular path, because that is the radial coordinate with respect to which, that is the center of force as far as this particular mass m1 is concerned, because it is being attracted towards that point irrespective of where it is on the plane. It is always being attracted towards this point. The reason for the attraction is the other guy is pulling on the string, but that is incidental. What is essential to this problem is that the m1 is always constantly attracted towards this hole. So this hole is the origin. And then, okay, let us bring up the potential energy term. As the radius increases, this particular mass will shift up because the string is inextensible. So actually, if you take this point as the origin, then the actual distance of this particular mass is L minus R, right? So Okay, good point. L minus R, is it? Yes, it will be L minus R. So if you increase the height, what happens? Or rather, when will the height increase? When R is increased. So it should be actually mg times R minus L. Rather, the height is measured from up to down. So in terms of the y coordinate, the potential energy will be mg times R minus L, or minus mg times L minus R, because the mass is below the point from which you are measuring. And therefore, as R increases, the potential energy increases in the gravitational field. That is the idea. That is why you have a plus sign on this point. And the constant term mgl has been neglected from the potential, because anyway a constant term in the potential does not affect the equation of motion, because to find the equation of motion you will take derivative of the potential and the constant term will anyway go away. So there is a hidden term mg times L, m2 times g times L, which has been omitted right from the beginning. I hope that clarifies that particular question.
There is also a request to explain this problem again, and somebody wants to know how the epsilon comes. Basically,
epsilon is already given in the question as the perturbation over and above R0. So you are told that in the problem, it is undergoing circular motion at R0, where everything is in perfect balance because it is under uniform circular motion without any perturbation. So the centripetal force acting on M1 transferred through the tension in the string is exactly balancing the weight of M2. That is what is happening at that particular point of time. And then what you do is somehow you just perturb this mass M1 slightly. As long as you don't perturb it too much, it will perform small oscillations around the circular path. This is what is given in the question. And what we obtain for the effective potential actually bears this out. But let me come to that part then. Basically, you have got in the effective potential, you have got two terms. Let us only restrict ourselves to this part before the second equal to sign. This is the kinetic, because you are already told it is uniform circular motion. Therefore, you assume that it is moving at L square by 2 m1 r square. Anyway, this is a potential energy term. Whatever else will come in the kinetic energy, which you are not currently concerning yourself with. In the potential, you will get the centrifugal barrier term L square by 2 m1 r square, and the gravitational potential energy of the mass m2, which is m2 g times r. Now you are told that r, which is the variable radial coordinate, is nothing but the original constant radius plus a certain amount epsilon, where epsilon is the variable, r0 is a constant for the uniform circular motion. So you rewrite r as r0 plus epsilon. This r also naturally the same substitution, r0 plus epsilon. And then you Taylor expand this one, because this one is already a linear term in the numerator. Taylor expand this particular term. What you end up with is this term. So this is the Taylor expansion up to the first three terms. Reason for this being that basically trying to preempt everything, you want to Taylor expand till you come to the quadratic term. The reason is that the quadratic term will represent this particular potential well which is there, and all the other terms can either be scaled away or shifted away, or they will cancel naturally. In this particular case, L square by 2 m1 r0 square exactly balances m2 g r0. So the first term and the fourth term will cancel each other anyway. Or no, they are constant. They are constant, and so they are basically they can be eliminated by shifting the potential. The third term and the fifth term together, because of this minus sign, they will cancel each other completely. And so in magnitude they are equal. Epsilon comes out, and whatever is there inside the bracket cancels each other completely. And so the only term you are left with is this, the third term. First and fourth are constant and can be shifted out. Second and fifth will cancel each other. So only the quadratic term actually survives as a dynamical term, which will actually describe the dynamics of the system. Rest of them are just additional terms which go away when the equation of motion are computed. So the effective potential energy for this looks like suppose it looks like the red curve. I have not actually plotted this, just a toy curve to illustrate that the effective potential just mimics the actual potential close to the equilibrium position. You are already told that epsilon is a very small perturbation from R0. So you are justified in taking this particular approximation. And this dotted line black curve is nothing but only the third term. Everything else is removed. So the only the third term. So the total equation of motion becomes half m r dot square plus this potential. And if this is the potential, then this is nothing but simple harmonic because all these terms are constant. And therefore, you can obtain from the idea of simple harmonic motion what is the oscillation potential or oscillation frequency. The idea in all small oscillation problems is what is written in red. Taylor expand till the quadratic term and retain only the quadratic term. The linear term and the constant term will cancel. This always happens because of this physical idea that even though there are other terms present in this red curve, what survives near the equilibrium position is only the quadratic is good enough to mimic the behavior near here. Well, I would like to make this statement here that this is something you take on faith in physics. Means it is not something you take on faith because God said so or something like that. It is something which comes out always through practice, that in a small oscillation problem, if you are expanding near a equilibrium position, the simplest approximation is always the quadratic. This is something which you can take on faith because you don't have time to see that everything else cancels. You assume happily that everything cancels and start with the quadratic term as your starting point. It will work. I'm asking you to take it on faith, but if you want to convince yourself, you can go back and do many problems of this type. You will find that the first approximation is the quadratic, and that mimics the position if you are sufficiently close to the equilibrium position. So for the net exam, I'm saying take it on faith that the quadratic is the only term which survives. Only evaluate the quadratic term properly. For that, you need practice of Taylor series expansions of various types of functions. That is how I would put it.
So one last question.
Yes, ma'am.
Is from Ishita Biswas.
Mm-hmm.
She is asking you to repeat one more time why option B is not the correct answer in scaling problem.
Okay, we are here immediately. Okay, so if the let me bring up the whole thing. If we are assuming that it is moving in a circular orbit, then the ratio of potential to kinetic energy remains constant. In other words, T is equal to minus half times V remains true throughout. But V itself, okay, in this case, we are okay. In this case, we are saying that G times R orbital turns out to be constant. Therefore, G divided by R orbital will not remain constant, it will change. So the potential energy will change, the kinetic energy will also change, and therefore the sum of the potential and kinetic energy will also change, and so the total energy remains constant is not a correct option. This is after you have solved the problem, but before solving the problem, my argument was as follows. And I, at that same time, I had pointed out it is a soft argument, it is not a conclusive argument. Point C is conclusive. The angular momentum is conserved. Number B was eliminated, not completely eliminated, but it is very unlikely to be the option on the following argument, that since G is reducing, and that means that the sun's attraction for the earth will reduce. So there is no, means it is very unlikely, it is very unphysical to feel that the earth will come closer to the sun because the attraction is reduced. If the attraction is reduced, why will the fellow come close? Either he will move away or he will remain at the same place. Coming close does not seem physically intuitive if the attraction force is reduced. Most likely he will move away, which is what happens in reality as we are seeing.
It also follows from Noether's theorem. There is Noether's the invariance under time translation is not valid.
Excellent. I didn't think of that. Yeah. But again, time translation, G is changing with time. So is it an exact symmetry or not?
Time is not invariant under time translation, and therefore energy need not be conserved.
Okay. Okay. Yes, G is varying with time, and therefore the total energy won't be conserved, and therefore the energy. Okay, I missed that. Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, follows directly. It is then the same argument as C, conservation loss.
So these are all the questions. Very nice session, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
Will you also be available to them on Moodle for chatting and answering questions?
Okay, I can open a chat on the classical mechanics section, and they can put up questions, and I'll answer from time to time. I can do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Siddharth sir. So now we end this session.